The HOA president stood on my porch like she was the high priestess of suburban perfection, clutching a stack of legal papers and wearing a smirk that made me want to check my blood pressure. And right then, looking past her shoulder at the shimmering blue water of Pinecrest Lake, I realized she had no idea that I actually owned the very ground her designer sandals were sinking into. My name is Julian, and about 6 months ago, I was one signature away from losing the only thing that tied me to my family's history. But as it turns out, when you try to bully a guy whose grandmother was a literal genius at record keeping, you're not just playing with fire. You're walking straight into a legal forest fire. It all started when I moved back to the family cabin, a sturdy, honest place built from hand-milled cedar back in '64, long before the surrounding hills were scalped to make room for, and quote, the Cascades, and quote, which is what they called the 40-odd cookie-cutter McMansions that had sprouted up like a beige fungus around the shoreline. I had just walked away from a high-stress corporate gig in Seattle after a divorce that left me more hollowed out than a rotted log, seeking nothing but the smell of pine and the sound of the wind through the needles. But apparently, my version of peace was a direct violation of Victoria Vance's vision for a pristine, uniform paradise. Victoria was the kind of woman who treated the HOA board like her personal star chamber, a self-appointed queen in tennis whites who spent her mornings measuring the height of people's grass with a literal ruler and her afternoons sending out fines for the, end quote, grave sin, end quote, of having a non-standard mailbox. She'd been poking at me for months, sending these increasingly frantic certified letters about my cabin's, end quote, distressed exterior, end quote, and the, end quote, negative impact on neighboring property values, end quote. But I'd mostly used them as kindling for the fireplace because, as far as I knew, this cabin had been grandfathered in since the dawn of time. But Victoria didn't oppose. T just wanted me to paint my cedar siding a shade of, end quote, sanctuary beige, end quote. She wanted me gone, seeing my rustic retreat as a blemish on her perfect canvas. And that Tuesday morning on the porch was her opening move in a war she thought I was too tired to fight. End quote. Julian, honey, end quote. She said, her voice dripping with that fake Southern hospitality that's actually just a polite way of being a sociopath, end quote. We've tried to be patient, but the board has voted to initiate a formal foreclosure on the basis of unpaid architectural fines and public nuisance statutes, so you have exactly 72 hours to vacate before the sheriff arrives, end quote. I just stood there, watching a hawk circle high above the lake, and I felt this strange, cold calm settle over me, remembering how my grandma Rose used to sit in a rocking chair on this very spot, winking at me while she filed away old deeds and saying that the land always remembers its true owners even when people forget. I didn't oppose. T argue with Victoria right then. I just watched her heels click-clack down my wooden stairs, a sound like a ticking clock, and as soon as her white SUV pulled away, I headed straight for the basement, where Rose had kept her, end quote, worthless archives, end quote, tucked away in a moisture-proof cedar chest. I spent the next 48 hours buried in yellowing maps and handwritten ledgers, fueled by nothing but black coffee and a growing sense of disbelief as I realized that the modern tax maps everyone in the Cascades relied on were about as accurate as a weather forecast in a hurricane. I called up an old friend from college, Marcus, who'd spent the last decade becoming the most expensive property litigator in the state, and when he saw the scans I sent over, I could practically hear his grin through the phone. End quote. Julian, end quote. He whispered, his voice thick with a kind of predatory joy, end quote. If these original homestead patents from 1888 are still valid, and I'm 99% sure they are because they were never formally vacated, you don an oppose. T just own a cabin. You own the entire structural foundation of that woman's ego, end quote. While I was doing my homework, Victoria was busy poisoning the well, spending her Wednesday organizing a neighborhood, end quote, safety and standards, end quote, rally at her place, where she served mimosas and told everyone that I was an unstable hermit who was single-handedly tanking their home equity. My neighbor across the road, a retired teacher named Mrs. Gable, who'd always been kind to me, slipped over that evening to tell me they were planning a vote to have me forcibly removed, her eyes darting around like she was afraid the HOA secret police were listening in the bushes. End quote. She told them you were a threat, Julian, end quote. Mrs. Gable said, her voice shaking. End quote. She said your cabin was a fire hazard waiting to happen and that you'd been making aggressive comments to the children at the bus stop, which we all know is a lie. But people are scared about their money, and fear makes them mean. End quote. I thanked her, feeling that cold fire in my chest grow hotter, and spent the rest of the night with a professional surveyor named Elias, who moved through the woods with a GPS unit and a silent, focused intensity that felt like we were setting up a military ambush. We discovered that the community park, where everyone held their weekend yoga classes, and a massive gravel parking lot that served as the only entrance for the lower half of the development wherein into Oppos, community property at all. In 1961, my grandfather had granted a temporary easement for, logging and access, an easement that had expired in 1991 and was never renewed, meaning every car driving into that neighborhood was technically committing civil trespass the moment they hit the gravel. But the Real, nuclear option, was hidden in a dusty folder labeled Riparian Rights and AMP. Flowage, where I found a series of documents proving that when the dam was built in the early 20th century, the water rights for the entire basin were tied to the original homestead deed. Victoria and her board had been charging residents $300 a month for, lake access, and boat slip rentals, a nice little earner that brought in over $100,000 a year, but the documents showed that the lake bottom and the water itself up to the high water mark belonged to the owner of the Rosewood cabin. That was me. Every boat anchored in that water, every dock floating on the surface, and every morning swim was technically happening on my private property, and the HOA had been running a commercial marina business on my land without paying me a cent in rent for 30 years. The day of the big, community meeting, felt heavy, like the air right before a thunderstorm, and the community center was packed to the rafters with people who'd been fed a steady diet of Victoria's lies for weeks. She was at the front of the room, looking like a general in a silk blouse, with a lawyer named Sterling by her side who looked like he'd been carved out of a block of expensive mahogany and arrogance. We are here to restore the integrity of the Cascades, Victoria announced, her voice projected through a PA system that made her sound like a god, and that means removing the rot that threatens our future. So we will now take a formal vote on the immediate seizure and demolition of the non-compliant structure known as the Rosewood cabin. I waited until the eyes had started to ripple through the room, a sea of hands going up from people who were too scared to look me in the eye, and then I stood up in the back row with Marcus and Elias by my side, holding a leather-bound folder that felt like a holy relic. Victoria, I said, my voice didn't in Oppos. Do you need a microphone to cut through the noise, before you vote on my life, I think everyone here should know exactly what they're paying for when they write those HOA checks every month. The room went silent, that kind of vacuum seal silence where you can hear a pin drop, and I nodded to Elias, who clicked a remote and projected a massive, high-definition map onto the back wall of the hall. See that red line? I asked, pointing to the boundary that sliced right through the middle of the community parking lot and a main access road. That's where my property begins, and that red line also extends under the water, covering every single boat slip and every square inch of the lake bottom in this valley. I watched the blood drain out of Victoria's face so fast, I thought she might actually faint, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while her lawyer, Sterling, scrambled to look at the documents Marcus was tossing onto the front table. The easement for your entrance expired in 1991, Marcus added, his voice smooth and lethal, which means the HOA has been collecting fees for access to land and water it doesn't in Oppos. Tion, which is a little thing we in the legal profession call in Oppos, systematic commercial fraud in Oppos, and in Oppos, unjust enrichment. In Oppos, The room erupted, but it wasn't in Oppos. The kind of anger Victoria had been banking on. It was the sound of 47 homeowners realizing they'd been sold a bill of goods by a woman who'd been treating their money like her personal piggy bank. Mrs. Gable stood up, her face flushed with a new kind of courage, and asked the question that broke the dam. Victoria, if Julian owns the lake, then what has the HOA been doing with the $60,000 we pay in slip fees every year? That was when Garrett, another neighbor I've been working with, stepped up with a stack of bank statements he'd obtained through a whistleblower on the board, showing that over $20,000 a year had been diverted into, in quote, administrative expenses, in quote, that looked suspiciously like Victoria's travel and wardrobe budget. I watched Victoria try to regain her footing, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. But the smirk was gone, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic as the sheriff, who had been invited there to arrest me, stepped toward the front of the room to have a very quiet, very serious conversation with her about the financial records. It was like watching a house of cards get hit by a leaf blower. Within an hour, the end quote, safety and standards, end quote, rally had turned into an impromptu impeachment hearing, and by the following Monday, Victoria had, end quote, resigned, end quote, and put her McMansion on the market at a 20% discount just to escape the looming lawsuits. But here's the thing. I didn't oppose. T want to be the new dictator, and I didn't oppose. T want to watch my neighbors lose their life savings because of one woman's greed. So I sat down with a new, temporary board, and we worked out a deal that actually made sense. I granted a permanent, legal easement for the parking lot and the road in exchange for a total exemption from all HOA rules and fees for as long as the Rosewood cabin stood. And I leased the lake access back to the community for $1 a year, provided they established a conservation fund to keep the water clean. We turned the old HOA, in quote, enforcement, in quote, budget into a community improvement fund. And for the first time in 30 years, people started painting their houses colors they actually liked instead of, in quote, sanctuary beige, in quote. And the neighborhood finally started feeling like a neighborhood instead of a high-security prison for middle-aged golfers. As for me, I'm still sitting on my porch every morning, watching the loons dive in a lake that I technically own but have decided to share, and every time I see a neighbor wave as they drive past that gravel lot, I'm reminded of what Grandma Rose said about the land remembering. It's funny how a little bit of research and a whole lot of patience can turn an eviction notice into a fresh start, and it makes me wonder how many other people out there are living under the thumb of some petty tyrant just because they haven and oppose. T looked at their own deeds yet. So I've got to ask you guys, have you ever dealt with a, quote, neighborhood queen, quote, like Victoria, or found out that the rules you were living by were built on a total lie? I want to hear your HOA horror stories or your, quote, little guy, quote, victories in the comments, because sometimes the only way to beat a bully is to realize you're the one holding the keys to the kingdom. If you enjoyed this journey of legal revenge and community restoration, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't oppose. Miss the next time we take a stand against the beige vinyl dictators of the world, because the land always has a story to tell if you're willing to listen.